Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're uncovering a shocking truth as the CEO discovers that Tieu Lac never took the money everyone accused her of accepting. Instead, she sacrificed everything to protect him and the village. But then a hidden memo reveals one terrifying phrase: proceed with Phase 2. So what was Phase 2, and was Tieu Lac removed from his life just before someone tried to destroy him? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The CEO returned to the city with only one thing on his mind: Locker 317. The key he had found hidden beneath the floorboards in Tieu Lac's house no longer felt like a random object from his forgotten past. It felt like a warning, like someone had expected that one day he might need to find his way back to the truth. By late afternoon, he arrived at a private records facility connected to one of the family's holding companies. His trusted employee was already waiting. You confirmed the locker? Yes. Still active? Yes. Under whose name? The employee checked the tablet in his hand. Not a personal name. It's tied to one of your old executive access codes. The CEO looked at him. So it was mine. That's what it looks like. They walked down a long corridor lined with metal lockers. 317 was near the end. The CEO stopped in front of it. For a few seconds, he didn't move. Then he inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside, he expected to find the flash drive from his returning memories. But there was no flash drive. Instead, he found a thick brown envelope, several folded documents, an old memory card, and a sealed file. Across the front of the file was one name: Tieu Lac. The CEO's expression changed immediately. He opened it. The first page looked like a legal agreement. At first, the language was cold and formal. Then he reached the first condition. He read it once, then again. Tieu Lac agrees to permanently withdraw from all personal contact with the CEO. The CEO's jaw tightened. He turned the page. The agreement required Tieu Lac to leave the city. She was not allowed to visit him in the hospital. She was not allowed to contact him through doctors, staff, friends, or relatives. She was forbidden from publicly claiming a relationship with him. The CEO felt anger rising with every line. What is this? His trusted employee stepped closer. The CEO kept reading. Then he reached the section explaining what Tieu Lac would receive in return. He suddenly stopped. One clause stated that the family would continue paying for all medical treatment related to the CEO's accident. Another clause promised that the family would not interfere with the agricultural development project supporting the villagers. The CEO slowly lowered the paper. No. The employee looked at him. What? This wasn't a settlement. He looked back at the document. This was pressure. His voice became colder. They told her to disappear from my life in exchange for continuing my treatment. The employee said nothing. And they used the village too. He turned another page. If she refused, she risked my medical care and the project those people depended on. His hands tightened around the document. She didn't have a real choice. The employee carefully asked, "Is that her signature?" The CEO looked down. It was. He knew Tieu Lac's handwriting. He had seen it on old notes, school forms, and small labels around the village house. Yes. The word barely came out. She signed it. For several seconds, he simply stared at her name. Then another memory flashed through his mind. A hospital corridor. Tieu Lac standing outside a closed door. His mother facing her. Tieu Lac crying. Then darkness. The CEO pressed his fingers against his temple. "Sir?" "I'm fine." But his voice said otherwise. He turned another page. More conditions. Tieu Lac agreed not to challenge the family. She agreed not to speak publicly about the CEO's treatment. She agreed not to approach company leadership. And in exchange, a financial payment would supposedly be made to her. The CEO kept turning pages. Then he stopped. Page 12. Nothing after it. He checked again. The agreement ended abruptly. Where's the last page? The employee looked through the folder. There isn't one. There should be. How do you know? Because this page references final payment confirmation. The CEO pointed at the text. And there should be signatures from legal representatives. The employee nodded. So page 13 is missing. The CEO looked at the folder. Someone had removed it. That thought made everything worse. Who had access to this locker? We'll need to check archived access logs. Do it. The employee started typing. The CEO kept reading. Then one handwritten note caught his attention. A legal staff comment. Client accepted terms under emotional distress. Payment authorization pending final approval. The CEO stared at the sentence. Emotional distress. His expression darkened. They knew exactly what condition she was in. His trusted employee looked uneasy. Sir, maybe you should talk to her. The CEO immediately shook his head. No. Why? Because she already told me she wouldn't rebuild my past for me. He closed the folder. If I go to her now and ask whether she took money to leave me, I'll sound exactly like everyone else who judged her. He stood. I need facts first. Less than an hour later, the CEO entered the family residence. His mother was in the study. She looked up. Then she saw the folder. Her face changed. That reaction was enough. You recognize this? She stood slowly. Where did you find it? So you do. The CEO placed the agreement on the desk. His mother looked at the first page, then away. You made Tieu Lac sign this. She signed voluntarily. The CEO laughed once. Voluntarily, the word disgusted him. You threatened to stop paying for my treatment. That is not what happened. He opened the agreement. Then explain this. His mother didn't look. You were in critical condition. And the family was under enormous pressure. So Tieu Lac had to disappear. She was making things more difficult. The CEO stared at her. She stood outside the hospital because she loved me. She had no legal standing. She had my daughter. Silence. The CEO stepped closer. She was my family. His mother's face hardened. She was not your wife. And that gave you the right to threaten her? I protected you. There's that word again. The CEO looked at her with open anger now. You protected me by removing the woman I loved. You don't remember the full situation. Then tell me. His mother took a breath. You were unconscious. The board was unstable. Your father was under attack internally. The village project was tied to company funding. The CEO's eyes narrowed. And Tieu Lac? She was emotional. He almost laughed. She thought I might die. Yes. And you used that. His mother's expression tightened. You're oversimplifying. No. The CEO pushed the agreement toward her. I think it's very simple. He pointed at Tieu Lac's signature. You told her that if she walked away, my treatment would continue. Then another clause. And the village's project would be protected. His voice dropped. You made her choose. His mother said nothing. The CEO looked at her. What did you give her? Compensation. He froze. How much? His mother gave him the number. The CEO stared at her. It was enormous. And she accepted it? Yes. The answer came immediately, too immediately. The CEO looked back at the missing final page. Show me. His mother frowned. What? The payment. She took it. Then prove it. Her expression changed. The CEO stepped closer. There should be a bank transfer. Silence. There should be confirmation. Still nothing. You told me she left because she chose money. His mother's eyes hardened. She did. Then show me the money entering her account. For the first time, his mother had no answer. The CEO slowly picked up the folder, and in that silence, a new suspicion began to form. Maybe the missing final page had not been removed to hide how much Tieu Lac received. Maybe it had been removed because she had never received anything at all. The CEO left his mother's house with the agreement still in his hand. He didn't argue anymore. He didn't ask another question. Because at that point, one thing mattered more than anything she could say. Proof. If Tieu Lac had truly accepted money to leave him, there would be a record, a bank transfer, a receipt, something. By the time he returned to his private office, his trusted employee was already waiting. The CEO placed the documents on the desk. Trace every payment connected to this agreement. The employee looked through the pages. How far back? From the day she signed. And what exactly are we looking for? The compensation. The CEO's voice was calm, but his expression wasn't. My mother says Tieu Lac took the money. The employee nodded. So you want to confirm where it went? No. The CEO looked directly at him. I want to know the truth. They started with the financial authorization. The amount appeared exactly as his mother had described. It was large enough to change someone's life completely. The transfer had been approved through one of the family's holding companies. Legal had signed. Finance had processed it. Everything looked normal, until the employee opened the banking record. He frowned. Sir, what? The beneficiary doesn't match. The CEO stood immediately. What do you mean? The agreement names Tieu Lac. Yes. But the money never entered her account. The room went silent. Check again. I already did. Check every account connected to her. The employee searched again. Personal account, savings, any account linked to her identification. Nothing. No large deposit, no hidden payment, no transfer from the family. The CEO slowly walked closer to the screen. So she never received it? No. His chest tightened. Where did the money go? The employee opened the transaction chain. The funds left the family holding company. Then, less than 2 hours later, they were redirected. To where? A charitable development foundation. The CEO frowned. What foundation? The employee pulled up the details. One of the group's rural support funds, the same organization that later helped finance several agricultural projects, including the strawberry project in Tieu Lac's village. The CEO stared at the screen. That can't be coincidence. There's more. The employee opened an archived attachment. A scanned handwritten note appeared. The CEO immediately recognized the signature. Tieu Lac. He leaned closer. The note was short. I do not want personal compensation. If this agreement cannot be changed, use the money to protect the village project and the families depending on it. The CEO read it once, then again. His eyes began to burn. She had refused the money. She had signed away the right to stay beside him. She had accepted being called greedy. She had allowed his family to believe she had walked away for cash, and she had taken nothing for herself. The employee remained silent. The CEO sat down slowly. For years, Tieu Lac had stayed in that small village house, worked in the fields, raised their daughter, lived simply. And all that time, someone had been telling a completely different story. She never took it. The employee shook his head. No. The CEO looked at the agreement. But my mother said she did. Maybe she was told that. The CEO's eyes narrowed. That possibility was even worse. Find the missing last page. Page 13. Yes. If the physical copy is missing, the legal archive may have a scan. Then get it. Nearly an hour later, the employee found an old backup. Page 13 appeared on the screen. The CEO immediately saw Tieu Lac's signature. Then another section. Beneficiary amendment requested by Ms. Tieu Lac. Below it, the document confirmed the compensation had been redirected away from her personal account. But one detail made the CEO freeze. A witness signature, his father. The CEO stared at it. My father knew. The employee nodded. He witnessed the amendment. The CEO leaned back. His father had known Tieu Lac rejected the money. Yet somehow, the story that she had accepted it survived for years. He picked up his phone and called his mother. She answered quickly. Did you find what you were looking for? The CEO said nothing for a second. Then, Tieu Lac never took the money. Silence. I found the transfer. Still silence. She redirected it to the village project. His mother finally spoke. You don't understand what happened. Then explain it. I was told the agreement had been completed. By whom? Another pause. The CEO's suspicion deepened. Mother. The legal department. Which person? Silence again. The CEO stood. Which person? Her voice became quieter. The same board member you've been investigating. The CEO froze. The man connected to my accident? Yes. Now everything felt different. That man had appeared near his car before the crash. He had been linked to the missing technician. He had met secretly with the CEO's mother, and now he was also connected to the agreement that separated Tieu Lac from him. Why would he care whether Tieu Lac stayed with me? His mother didn't answer immediately. Because you changed when you were with her. What does that mean? You started refusing the board. You questioned company decisions. You talked about leaving. Her voice trembled slightly. Tieu Lac wasn't dangerous because of who she was. The CEO's jaw tightened. She was dangerous because I was willing to walk away for her. His mother stayed silent. That silence confirmed it. The CEO ended the call. That evening, he drove back to the village. Tieu Lac was outside hanging clothes when he arrived. She saw the folder in his hand and immediately became guarded. What happened? The CEO stopped in front of her. I found the agreement. Her face changed. You remember signing it? Yes. My mother told me you took the money. Pain flashed across her face. So that's why you came? No. He shook his head. I came because I know you didn't. Tieu Lac stared at him. The CEO held out the handwritten note. I found this. She looked down, her own handwriting, her own signature. For a moment she couldn't speak. You gave it all to the village. They needed it. And you took nothing. I never wanted their money. The CEO's voice softened. Why didn't you tell anyone? Tieu Lac looked away. Would anyone have believed me? He had no answer. She continued. I signed because they told me your treatment might be affected. And the village project? They threatened that too. Tieu Lac swallowed. I was scared. The CEO looked at her. But you still refused the money. Yes. Her voice became firm. I left you. She paused. But I never sold our love. That sentence hit him hard. The CEO lowered his eyes. Then he handed her the missing final page. There's something else. Tieu Lac looked at the witness signature. Your father. He knew. She stared at him. And the board member handled the agreement. The same one connected to your accident? Yes. Before either could speak again, the CEO's phone vibrated. A new message from his trusted employee. Attached was an archived internal memo. The CEO opened it. His face immediately changed. Tieu Lac noticed. What is it? He turned the screen toward her. The memo had been sent one day after she signed the agreement. Only one sentence appeared. Once she is removed from his life, proceed with Phase 2. Tieu Lac went pale. What is Phase 2? The CEO stared at the message. He didn't know. But the date made one thing horrifyingly clear. Someone had needed Tieu Lac out of his life first, and only days later, his car crashed. The CEO discovers a shocking agreement that Tieu Lac was forced to sign after his accident. She had to leave him, stop all contact, and disappear from his life in exchange for continued medical treatment and protection for the village's agricultural project. His mother insists that Tieu Lac accepted a huge payment, but the final page of the agreement is missing. Determined to uncover the truth, the CEO traces the transaction and discovers that the money never entered Tieu Lac's account. Instead, she had secretly redirected it to support the village project. A recovered document proves she refused personal compensation, while the CEO's father witnessed the amendment. Even more disturbing, the same board member linked to the accident handled the agreement. Then an internal memo reveals a chilling message. Once Tieu Lac was removed from his life, Phase 2 could begin.